Indy, it's a pleasure to see you again. We're honored to have you with us on this recorded session, but we have a lot to go through. The world keeps tumbling from crisis to crisis, from COVID to these storms and floods and, too much water, too little water, fires, death tolls that are just unimaginable. I mean, when I think back, that COVID actually took 6.5 million lives, over 600 million infected people, and not to mention the economic, social, and gender-based violence tolls. We're talking about unsettled times and unsettled lives and livelihoods at a very different scale, at a different magnitude. We got to change. As governments, as UNDP, as organizations, as private sector, the whole of society has to change. And what I'm looking to hear from you, and my first question is, what do you see in the future, and how do we cope with all these risks, and where are we going? Where are we heading?
No, firstly, it's a genuine honor to be here with you. I really thank you, and thank you for everyone that's here. I know how difficult it is to concentrate on video, so I really appreciate the attention. I think it's such an important question. I do think more and more what's becoming very clear is, we used to talk about there being a crisis in the future and risk in futures. I think what's very clear is now the crisis is in the present day. And I think the crisis that we're starting to see, and the energy crisis that we're starting to see manifested, the food prices crisis, we're starting to see some of the systemic issues on the foundational economies of our present day world starting to actually become questionable and actually have very significant effects. So whether you look at the kind of whatever you want to call it, the kind of developed world, and I put that in quote marks because I don't think the developed world is that developed, but if you look at that, you've got countries like the UK, countries like Germany, spending vast amounts of money, warlike level subsidies to deal with which are systemic issues like energy. So I think one of the big things that we have to start to recognize is that we're now entering a phase of systemic crisis. And what we're seeing, whether it's flooding in Pakistan, or whether you're seeing heat, rivers drying up in Europe, or whether you're seeing the energy crisis as a result of geopolitics that is going to be kicked off and is being kicked off as a result of it, markets have become secondary to geopolitics. And in that framework, I think we're starting to see systemic vulnerabilities. I think the UNDP's report says that 95 countries around the world are now fragile. Fragile as a result of energy and food system costs. Now, that starts to open some really fundamental questions. For the first time in 2 years, we've had 2 years of the Human Development Report, which is an extraordinary piece of work by Pedro, starting to show human development is actually regressive for 2 years running. Right? So we are in a new paradigm of what the future starts to look and the fragility of the human civilization project as a whole. Second thing I'd say is that for the first time, and this is kind of slightly controversial, but I think really important, is that more and more, I think it is being recognized, even with pain, that the challenges that we face are fundamentally planetary challenges. And actually, whilst countries can individually do things about this, this will require a planetary response because the nature of the problem is fundamentally planetary. And the idea that one nation can survive this at the behest of other nations not actually is a fundamental fallacy. And it's the volatility that will drive this story. And the volatility of the availability of agriculture, crops being lost. I think the US is about to lose a whole bunch of crops. We're going to see crop losses, which is going to drive volatility. The volatility means the food prices are going to go up from average 10% to more than 20%. So we're starting to see these system level risks start to manifest. And then after that, I think the key question that isn't often talked about is the human development crisis. I think that every industrial transformation, every large-scale revolution has been based on actually a human development revolution. And what we don't talk about is what is the 21st century human development revolution that's required. We're also seeing, I think this is where UNDP can play a really important role, is what I would call transnational projects. And transnational projects are going to be absolutely vital, whether they're ecological restorations of transnational critical ecological systems or whether they're other forms of infrastructure. And I think that's going to be a key point because it's going to require political diplomacy, whether it's, for example, a river that goes across multiple nations or actually key ecological systems. Building and not just preserving those systems, but actually ecologically restoring and regenerating those systems is going to require a new theory of transnational innovation. So I think that my big message here is that we've got big crises and they're going to require big responses. And more the question is, how do we do big responses?
One of the things that you touched on are three points that I can relate to, or at least the past decade or two, is one, with all of these risks, there are opportunities. And we've seen that even during COVID, there are many governments that came with out of the box. And I'm just using the COVID example, there's the food example, fuel crisis and so forth. Even the wars that are at play right now globally. Many governments have come up with new strategies. And I think there's an opportunity in where we are at this moment in time and place. And that opportunity needs to be seized for the climate agenda, for the social agenda, and new social contracts with governments, and new civic contracts with governments. And the question I'm posing to you, having traveled the world and worked with so many countries, I know, for example, in UAE and Emirates, they're just about to open one of the largest new cities that's going to be fully 100% renewable and based on old traditional technology, vernacular technology and architecture. I know that many other countries around the world have many new projects of this sort. Can you share with us a few of these cutting edge examples, and especially the ones that are far from where we are in this part of the world, but also that you think we can learn from as small island states?
Absolutely. And I think you highlight, firstly, exactly rightly, that crisis is going to create liquidity, both in a political sense and a financial sense. That liquidity, using that liquidity well, is really important. We've got an opportunity for real structural reform, both in terms of how government communicates, how we construct policy, and how we construct legitimacy in the 21st century. And that's going to be a real, so that's one dimension. Second dimension is obviously, I think we're starting to see, as I was saying, the kind of super scale type projects start to emerge, and you're starting to see them. Almost every city in the world is going to have to look at electrification. Almost every city in the world is going to have to look at nature-based assets and the kind of tree canopies or the whole environmental landscape. So we're starting to see cities, whether it's Glasgow looking at building a tree canopy, or whether it's actually Dubai, and one of the cities in Dubai looking at how do you build a new microclimate using nature-based solutions, because actually the air is wet. So how do you actually use that to construct actually genuine microclimates? So we're starting to see new scales of thinking. This is the moment for UNDP to start to think at a scale, because I think governments are feeling the problem at that scale. And I think we need to now respond at that scale. And I think that's going to be a strategic opportunity.
Absolutely. And this takes me, it's a great segue to how to bring this down to SIDS and Eastern Caribbean, because I really believe in innovation, but I believe in innovation that leads to a result. And this has been one of my conversations with Akeem, in that we cannot replace companies like yours, like Dark Matter, or academic institutions that need to do research and development for the sake of research and development. Our role is to be by the side of governments, private sector, and civic engagers and actors to help them maneuver what they're facing using these innovative ideas and approaches and techniques that come out of other partners that we could partner with. And the question is now, how do we now take some of all of these innovations in acceleration labs and all of these innovations that are, for me, more important, happening out there, and then help governments use them to change their vision, shift gears, and move into a totally new lane. One of the reasons why our focus is blue, green, and orange is I don't want to break it down anymore into social and governance and climate. That's not going to work. And how do we build the capacities and nurture within those capacities the ability to be adaptive and resilient and responsive to risk and change and become risk takers as individuals within this group that you're talking to? How does each one of us become an innovator and take more risks? And how do we, as supervisors, allow for that risk and failure? So what is your parting remark to us as we move forward, but with a specific context of SIDS and Eastern Caribbean?
No, I really appreciate that. I mean, the first point I would sort of just want to pick up is your point about risk. And currently, if you're not taking risk, you're leaving risk for other people to manage. Mm-hmm. And so, somebody not taking risk is meaning that risk is unmanaged in society and is going to affect other people's lives. So it's not risk for the sake of glory, it's risk for the management of actually civilization and people around us. And I think we have to understand the risk of doing nothing is far outweighs the risk of doing something. UNDP has a critical role to play because governments have built for what I would call evolution and incremental transitions. That's what they're built for. They're designed for continuous optimization processes. UNDP has the capacity to build what I think is the bridging capacity to deal with these large-scale developmental needs. I think what UNDP really can play a really critical role in, we call these system demonstrators, large-scale system demonstrators, is that you have to be able, you uniquely can not only support the innovation necessary for the execution of the mission, but then the project structuring to deliver against that mission. And that combination is your unique power. You've built the innovation capacity, but you also have the rigor, the capacity to hold the execution of super scale projects, which actually, very few governments have that capacity right now. Especially, and I would say more and more, transnational innovation, which is multi-state innovation, is a key gap because there's no trusted diplomatic innovation capacity that's necessary for that. So I think that's where you're going to see, whether it's kind of fisheries preservation and fisheries advancements or ecological, like you say, blue sequestration capabilities working across governments. I think there's going to be a massive opportunity for transnational innovation, which I think UNDP will play what we call public diplomacy innovation capacity, which is going to be the fundamental for building that, which I think you're so well placed to do.